Hello, my name is Adam Gray, and welcome to Lesson 7.2 on wrong answer pathologies. Wrong answer pathologies are another way of saying things that make an answer wrong. And specifically, we're going to see wrong answer pathologies for the CARS section of the exam. This is one of those lessons that's going to help build your MCAT expertise, meaning it's going to focus on things we know about the MCAT, the things they do over and over again that will give you that edge on test day. Specifically, the MCAT tends to have the same sorts of wrong answer choices over and over again. And finding a wrong answer choice is almost as good as finding the right answer choice. The learning goal of this lesson is for you to be able to recognize these wrong answer choices, because as soon as you recognize them, you can eliminate them and you're that much closer to the right answer choice. Maybe you're even done with the question and you move on. The structure of this lesson is as follows. We're going to do two different exercises. The first one is going to see a bunch of wrong answer choices and give names to these pathologies, out of scope, distortion, and so on. And then the second exercise is going to focus more on what word in an answer choice disqualifies it from being correct, because that is the procedure you're going to use on test day to eliminate choices most often. Let's jump right in. In order to explore the wrong answer pathologies in the CARS section, we have to have a little bit of a passage, just this one paragraph. So go ahead and read this to yourself and make just a few words of a label for this paragraph, just as you would if it were in a full passage. Go ahead, read it and label it now. So what this very short passage, single paragraph, does is it focuses on some things that were true before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And as usual, if you're not familiar with the history of civil rights or this Voting Rights Act, that's going to be okay, because you don't need to know that outside knowledge for test day. Specifically, the paragraph first mentions laws that disenfranchised minority voters or stopped them from voting. Then there's a nice contrast keyword here, nevertheless. And then it talks about how civil rights advocates attempted to circumvent those laws. And if they're circumventing something that prevents them from voting, that means these civil rights advocates helped them to vote. So if you had a label, it could be something along these lines. Before the Voting Rights Act, we have some examples of ways that voters were hurt, prevented from voting, and were helped to vote, in spite of those ways that they were disenfranchised. But enough with this passage. Let's talk about some wrong answer choices. This question here, number 1, is an example of the sort of question you might see attached to this paragraph on test day. It asks, which of the following was used to prevent the disenfranchisement? Preventing disenfranchisement means it's going to be looking for things from the second half of that paragraph, things that were helping out the voters. And this table at the bottom of your screen is a little bit different than any set of answer choices we have ever seen so far. All 7 of these answer choices are all wrong. We guarantee there's no right answer to this question. But what we're going to see is why these 7 answer choices are wrong. The first one here mentions the 14th and 15th amendments. And let's go back to the passage to see why this answer choice is wrong. Now, this passage does actually mention the 14th and the 15th amendments, right there in the middle. And these amendments are even cited as things that would help voters, because we see that these laws, the ones that disenfranchised voters, were a clear violation of these amendments. So these laws had to violate the amendments in order to disenfranchise voters. So 14th and 15th amendments, they're pro-voter. However, this detail of the amendments is not a way that the civil rights advocates tried to help disenfranchise parties. The 14th and 15th amendments were in place long before, and so they were more of a baseline situation than something that was incorporated later to try and help them. We call that kind of answer choice a FUD, or faulty use of detail. And it's revealed there in those 3 words, faulty use of detail. That it is a detail that appears in the passage, 14th and 15th amendments, but it's used in a faulty way or a wrong way by the answer choice. This answer choice is trying to suggest that it was one of these things in the second half of the paragraph. However, it wasn't in the second half of the paragraph, it was in the first half. So the detail is being used wrong, and that's why it's a wrong answer. Let's move to this second one about grandfather clauses. So if this was an answer choice to this question, abolishing grandfather clauses, let's see where this is in the passage and why it would be wrong. go ahead and find out where grandfather clauses are mentioned in the passage and why this answer choice of abolishing grandfather clauses would be incorrect. Grandfather clauses are found here at the end of the passage. So at first you might think, oh, it's in the second half. We've been looking for things that are in the second half of the paragraph. This must be right. However, we're told in the passage that the civil rights advocates established the grandfather clauses, not abolished them. The grandfather clauses, on the other hand, were there to help the voters, not to hurt them. So we call this type of answer choice an opposite answer choice. It's the exact opposite of correct. Then in the third line of this table, we have a similar answer choice, but it says abolishing all grandfather clause laws. Now, that is also an opposite answer choice because grandfather clauses helped voters, didn't hurt them. But it's also what we call a extreme answer choice. That fourth column over there stands for distortion and extreme, which are similar. A distortion answer choice takes an opinion in the passage and distorts it in a certain way that makes it wrong. An extreme answer choice is one that distorts it in a particular way. It makes it more extreme than the author would ever actually say, given what we know about them and the way that they write. Whenever you see an answer choice with all, never, only, any of these exclusive and strong words in them, that's very likely to be an extreme answer choice, so you should always think twice about picking it, because it's likely that it's a wrong answer. Now we have this fourth answer choice. That is, it's throwing out the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other words, if we connect it back to this question stem, was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 used to help out voters before the Voting Rights Act of 1965? And this answer choice, like the rest, is going to be wrong, but it's going to be wrong because it is an out of scope. That's what OS stands for, an out of scope answer choice. Because you can go back to the paragraph if you want, that Civil Rights Act is never mentioned in the passage. Never there at all. Totally outside of the scope. Never there at all. And that's what we mean by outside the scope of the passage. As long as you're reading and outlining passages well, if you ever read an answer choice and think, what? Wait, I haven't heard that at all before, then you should think twice about picking it. It very well could be an out-of-scope answer choice. Those are the sorts of traps the MCAT just might leave for you. Now we get a chance to look at the fifth wrong answer choice. Now that you've gotten a chance to see each of the four main wrong answer pathologies, go ahead and try this one for yourself. Which wrong answer pathology or pathologies, you can pick more than one, does this one fall into? The one that says counteracting and repealing these literacy tests and poll taxes. So this one's kind of interesting. It could fall into a lot of these different categories, and that's actually pretty common for wrong answer types. If there's more than one reason that they're wrong, well, then they're still just as wrong as if there's only one reason. But what's interesting is why this one is wrong. In the first sense, it's a faulty use of detail. Because literacy tests and poll taxes, those are mentioned in the passage. You probably remembered reading them. But they were mentioned only as things that held back voters, that contributed to disenfranchisement. They were never mentioned in the fact that they were ever counteracted or repealed. In the same way, this can be considered an opposite answer choice. Because in the second half of the paragraph, we're told that the civil rights advocates often tried to circumvent the laws, but there's nothing that seems to suggest that they were able to actually get rid of the laws or repeal them, which is what the answer choice says, meaning the laws stayed in place. So it would be an opposite answer choice. And finally, it's also an out-of-scope answer choice in a way, because those concepts of counteracting and repealing never showed up in the passage. You might have read those two words and thought, hey, I don't remember seeing those verbs at all, and you'd be right. That's why it's an out-of-scope answer choice. Try out the next one down, the second to last one on the list. Pick one or more wrong answer pathologies for that one. Now, this one might have just screamed out to you because it mentions non-minority voters, which is a classic example of an out-of-scope answer choice. Minority voters are mentioned in the first sentence of the paragraph, but non-minority voters never mentioned at all. And this just as easily can be considered a distortion answer choice, because we learn about the opinions of the civil rights advocacy groups, and they have certain opinions, but this takes their opinions and brings them to a place where we haven't necessarily learned that they go. We learn that they try to help out minority voters, but we never specifically get that they try to help non-minority voters. It's a perfect example of a distortion, something that goes a little bit too far or to a bit of a different place. Last but not least for this exercise, go ahead and try the 7th wrong answer choice, the one about the Supreme Court. What pathologies does that one fall into? Back in the passage, the Supreme Court is mentioned right here in the middle. However, the Supreme Court is mentioned in the first half of the paragraph as actually a group that upheld these laws that were disenfranchising voters. So therefore, for the purposes of this passage, the Supreme Court is something that contributed to disenfranchisement, that hurt voters, rather than something that helped prevent the disenfranchisement. For that reason, the Supreme Court in one case is a faulty use of detail because the detail is there but used for a different reason in the passage. And it's also an opposite answer choice because the Supreme Court was really put on one side of the scale in the passage, but this answer choice is suggesting it would be on the other side of the scale. And you might have done this exercise, especially the ones you did on your own, and thought that it's a little bit overwhelming. You might have thought, wait, why do I have to learn all these new terms of faulty use of detail, out of scope, and so on? Isn't it enough to just think an answer is wrong, to be able to tell that it's wrong and not necessarily have a word for why it's wrong? And your speculation is actually correct. All that really matters is that you're able to identify that an answer is wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that learning these terms and seeing in the answers and explanations to questions that you do, seeing things like distortion, extreme, out of scope, can't help you. Because if, for instance, you see that in one practice test, you get a whole lot of out of scope answer choices, or you pick a lot of extreme answer choices, that's a pattern of your own test taking that you can follow and try to fix. If you always fall for extreme answer choices, you need to be that much more careful for answer choices that have that extreme language or take extreme viewpoints. But in the spirit of that attitude of, hey, can't I just identify that it's wrong and move on? We've got another exercise for you. Let's see that one now. So in one sense, this exercise is similar to the last one. It's giving us one question stem. In this case, notice that the question stem is asking us which measures were taken to disenfranchise the voters. So this is a question that's asking for things from the first half of the paragraph rather than the second half. But it gives us one question stem, and we've got 6 answer choices, all of which are wrong. Guaranteed there's wrong, there's no right answer here. But this time, the exercise is different. Instead of naming the kind of wrong answer pathology, you want to take your pen or pencil in your book and circle the word or phrase that makes these answer choices wrong. That is, if you're reading an answer choice and thinking, this really sounds right, except for this one word that makes it wrong, that's the word that you should circle. This exercise is all about training your instincts, training your nose to smell a rotten answer choice. One example, this first answer choice, is that the word only is what disqualifies it. Because even though the first half of the paragraph mentions literacy tests and poll taxes and so on as things that disenfranchise voters, there's nothing the passage says that it's only those things that were used to disenfranchise them. They're merely mentioned as examples. So the word only is what disqualifies it. It disqualifies it as an extreme answer choice, if you're wondering about the pathology, but that's the word that should make this choice look bad to you. So now with these other 5 answer choices, look at them, look back at the paragraph in your book, and circle that word or phrase that makes it wrong to you, and then we'll go over them all. So let's see now what made these choices wrong. The second wrong answer choice is wrong because of these first few words, civil rights leaders. And really, you might have just read those first 3 words and immediately known it was wrong, because civil rights leaders, in the last sentence of the paragraph, are mentioned as the people who help prevent disenfranchisement, the people who are trying to help the voters. And so anything done by civil rights leaders is not going to be a correct answer to this question, because this question is looking for things that act to disenfranchise voters. Next is the third answer choice. And what makes this one wrong are the words technically legal. The way you can know this answer is wrong is to go back to the detail that it references. It references the 14th and 15th Amendments. And if you go back to the passage, you can see that these laws were, according to the author, a clear violation of the 14th and 15th Amendments. If laws are a clear violation of something, that doesn't mean they're technically legal. That phrase, clear violation, is a very polarizing keyword. It's the way the author says, no, there was no question that this was a violation. It was not technically legal, it was illegal. That's why the words technically legal make that answer choice wrong. Next is the fourth answer choice. This one goes wrong, we'll say, by the words set forth by. Although really you could have also said it's the words the Supreme Court that makes it wrong. But the important thing is you understand why that makes it wrong. And it's because back here in the passage, we do see that the Supreme Court upheld these laws under the protection of states' rights, but all we see is that the Supreme Court upheld laws that were already there. They did not set forth the laws themselves. These discrimination laws were not, as the answer choice says, initiatives set forth by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court merely saw the laws later and said, oh, I guess those are okay. So even though it's a subtle point, that verb set forth by versus upheld is what makes this answer choice wrong. Just a couple more left. And this fifth one might have been a little bit easier for you than the last couple because it's got the same clue as two of the answer choices from the last exercise, which is grandfather clauses. It was made clear in the last sentence of the paragraph that grandfather clauses were helping voters, not hurting them. And so states passing the grandfather clauses were not taken to disenfranchise the minority voters. This would be an opposite answer choice or a faulty use of detail because it goes in the wrong way. It uses the grandfather clauses in a different way than the passage actually does, which makes it wrong. And then finally, there's this last answer choice. It mentions the Supreme Court again, but it goes wrong in a different way than the last answer choice that mentioned them. It goes wrong with the word suppression. And the way we can tell this is why is to go back to the passage and look at what the connection between states' rights and the Supreme Court is. Specifically, we see that the Supreme Court upheld these laws in the protection of states' rights. So the passage clearly states that the Supreme Court was trying to say, oh, we're helping states' rights. We're not trying to suppress them. And that's why the word suppression is what makes that last answer choice wrong. So that gives you a little taste of what's going on behind the scenes as the AAMC writes questions and wrong answer choices to distract you. If you understand the major patterns behind these wrong answer choices and then just manage to read them accurately, you're going to be really close to getting the right answer because you'll see those wrong answer choices and you'll smell that they're rotten right away and eliminate them. Now again, studying wrong answer choices shouldn't take as much study time as reviewing your content or doing a lot of reading or understanding how to predict and match answer choices really well. But the reason we cover wrong answer choices in this lesson is because it's not something you want to leave on the table. It's very likely that at some point in your study, you're going to notice a pattern in why you pick certain wrong answer choices. And the concepts in this lesson, the different pathologies, and the concept that a single word tends to be what makes an answer choice rotten, that's what's going to help you fix those problems when you notice them in your study. So keep an eagle eye out for them and use the concepts in this lesson once you find those. Now let's quickly review the wrong answer choice pathologies that we just saw. The first was faulty use of detail, which is tempting because it'll be something that you remember. You'll recognize it from the passage, but the answer choice will be using it wrong. Maybe it's something from the wrong paragraph or the wrong sentence, or used for a different reason than the answer choice is trying to suggest. The second type was opposite, which is wrong because, well, it's the opposite of correct, but it's more tempting than you might think because an opposite answer choice will look very similar to our good answer choice. There might only be one word difference. It might have the word not in it, or it might say the word most instead of least. And if you miss that one word, you might pick an opposite answer choice by mistake. The third type is out of scope. These are ones that are wrong because they're outside the content area of the passage. You'll read them and think, wait a second, I didn't read this in the passage at all. That's what makes an out of scope answer choice. And then finally, there's the distortion or extreme. It takes something that the author does have an opinion on, that the author does mention, but takes it too far or in a different direction. And one of the most common ways it takes it is by taking a moderate opinion of the author and making it too extreme. So look out for those in particular. And that's the end of this lesson. This has been a short little trip down the road of wrong answer pathologies, but when you see one of these on test day and you get a question right because you were able to identify it, you won't regret the time you spent. Thanks and good luck.
Hello, welcome to your Cap 1 MCAT class on identifying CARS question types. My name is Sam Fallon, and together we're going to explore, given that you already know a lot about the different types of CARS questions and you've seen them and you answered them, how to identify them quickly in a triage type situation or a planning type situation to most efficiently get you that answer on test day. Therefore, the goal of this lesson is going to be to look at a CARS problem and identify the question type once you read through it. So you know a lot of the question types already. You've seen them in chapter 6 of this lesson book, and you've seen how to work through them and how to figure them out and effectively get to that answer. You also, however, need to develop the skill of identifying the question type right after looking at it and maybe glancing through the answer choices. There's a couple of important reasons why you might want to do this step of identifying the question type. One of them is that it helps triage the questions. So if you see a detail question or a main idea question, you know those are easier and you do them right away. Or if you see a strengthen and weaken beyond the passage or an apply question, you know those are a little bit harder. There's also another reason though, and that's to once you've triaged a question to do for now, during the plan step, you have to figure out what the task is of the question at hand. And if you know the question type almost directly gives you the task that that question is asking you to do. And so it's another way to more quickly figure out what's going on in a question and then more quickly get to the answer and therefore the correct answer. So here's a list of all the questions that you would see in a CARS section on the MCAT. They're broken down into 3 major areas, like we've talked about in chapter 6 of this lesson book. So that's foundations of comprehension, reasoning within the text, and then reasoning beyond the text. And you see all the different variants within. What we're going to do in this lesson is take a look at 10 questions, and the goal of each of the questions is to figure out what type of question that is to get that practice identifying questions. Then you'll take the skills that you learned in this lesson, practice with them as you do your CARS practice quizzes and your homework. For this lesson, we're going to go through 10 questions and identify the question types for each. Now, we'll go through these together, but go ahead and take a minute or two right now and try to identify the question type for each of these on your own first, and then come back and we'll go through them. So let's take a look at some of these questions. Starting off with number 1, we see that it says, this passage primarily concerns. This one ends up being a main idea question. Remember that for main idea questions, the easiest way to tackle one of these is to take a look at your passage outline and look at the goal that you wrote down for the passage, because that generally is what the answer to a main idea question will cover. Taking a look at the second one, they want to know, based on the passage, to know we're staying within the text, and then they're asking about some kind of theatrical concept. Because this is based on the passage, because it's going to need a specific item from the passage, we know that it could be a detail question. It might be something that we could just go back and look up, try to figure out where that is in the passage, read it, and then come back and the answer will be there. However, it could be something that the passage only hints at, only vaguely mentions, and you have to do some figuring out. If the answer choices give you something that isn't directly from the passage, this could end up being an inference question, where you can go back to the passage, research it, but come back and have to reason through the answer choices based on what you saw in the passage. Either way, detail or inference, the strategy is the same. You figure out where to go in the passage, you go to the passage, you do your research, and you come back, and then you pick your answer. Number 3 asks us why some list is in the passage. It's included in the passage because. Any questions to ask you why something is in the passage is going to be a function question. Again, the strategy is you go find that detail in the passage, read the context around it, figure out why the author did include that particular idea, and then come back and find your answer. The 4th question here gives us a phrase, offending sentiment, a paragraph reference, paragraph 2, and then asks us what this refers to from the passage. When you have to go back and find a meaning of a word or a phrase, we call that a definition in context question. You go to the word, you research the context of it, and then you come back and pick the correct definition in the answer choices. One note on definition in context questions, usually the answer choices will have the classic definition of a term or a word, and then also the more close definition from the passage. So watch out when you see the more classic definition of a word. It's usually in the answer choices, and it's usually wrong. Question 5 has some clues in it. First of all, as we're reading along, we see that there's a fact from the passage, the fact that congenital defects do something. And then that fact will cast doubt on something else. This is going to be a fact from the passage, so we know this is a reasoning question within the passage. And then we see that that fact is going to cast doubt on something. Cast doubt is a way of saying weaken, and so we can realize this is a strength and weaken question that comes right out of the passage. Or in other words, a strength and weaken within the passage question. Here you would go look up the fact, and then come back and reason your way through the answer choices, seeing which one this fact casts the most doubt upon. Question 6 stands in contrast to question 5 because it starts with this word suppose. Suppose is usually a clue that we're getting new information, and so we're going beyond the passage. But again, we're still looking at the effect of this information has on somebody's opinion. Therefore, this is again a strength and weaken question, but this time it comes from beyond the passage. So it's good to at least look at your passage outline for the opinion in question, and then work your way through the answer choices, reasoning what must be true to strengthen or weaken the given opinion. So we noticed that question number 6 is a pretty long question, and it's longer because it has to introduce a new fact, because we need that new fact to go beyond the passage, and that's why we've got to strengthen or weaken beyond the passage type question. If you compare it to question number 5 is a bit shorter because it didn't have to give us any new facts. It was the strengthen and weaken within the passage question, and therefore it ended up being shorter. Now, question 5 could be beyond the passage depending on what the answer choices were, but that new fact we see isn't in question number 5, where it is in question number 6, making question number 6 undeniably a beyond the passage question. This is one way you can kind of tell the difference between strengthen or weaken within or beyond the passage. Another way, though, is you'll remember the fact from having read it in the passage if it's a strengthen weaken within the passage question. If it's a new fact, then you'll realize that and it'll be a beyond the passage question. Question 7 is a tricky one. It's asking which of the following arguments, so the answer choices must be arguments, and they're looking for a justification or a support of the central thesis of the passage. Now we'd have to see the answer choices to really understand what kind of question this is, but the most likely choices here, since we're having to justify an argument or strengthen an argument, it could be a strengthen and weaken within the passage, or if the answer choices go beyond what the passage talks about, that could be a strengthen and weaken beyond the passage. Again, the strategy is the same. You'd either look at your outline, do a quick look at the passage, and then come back and reason your way through the choices, and then you'd be able to find your answer. Question 7 does have the slightest possibility of being possibly an inference question or possibly maybe even an other type question if the answer choices were quite unusual. But again, most likely it's a strengthen and weaken either within or beyond the passage. Don't worry, however, whichever type it is, the strategy remains the same. Refresh yourself on that central thesis, also known as the goal of the passage, in your outline. Go through the answers and pick the correct one. Number 8 talks about the author and how the author would be likely to agree with which of the following statements. This is a very common question type on the test, and depending on what the answer choices are, it's inference or apply. If the answer choices are from the passage and there are arguments that have been presented in the passage, that would be an inference question. However, if the answer choices go beyond the passage, they're brand new information, that would be the apply type question. You're still going to have to reason your way through the answer choices, and again, stick very closely with what the author exactly says or what the author implies by what he or she does say. Once you figure out what the author did say or what the author implied, then you can go back, work your way through the answer choices, see which one most closely aligns with what the author would agree with, and then pick that answer. A note on question 8 here, there is just the slightest possibility that question 8 could also be a detail question if the answers are specifically just details from the passage, not arguments from the passage, but it's unlikely that that probably will be this question type. It's just one of the rare detail types of questions you might see on the test. Again, don't worry here. Regardless of whether this is an inference or an apply question, your strategy is the same. You want to research what the author wrote or implied, and then reason your way through the answers. Number 9 gives us some clues to the classic type of question it is. They're giving us situations in the answers, and they want to know which of these resembles something from the passage. These answer choices therefore must be new information because they're bringing other things that would resemble something from the passage in. That's an apply question. Apply questions ask you to take information out of the passage and apply it to novel situations. Usually you'll find these situations in the answer choices, and therefore your task here is going to be apply that information from the passage onto the answer choices. You'll often see this type of apply question where you've got analogy type answers where the passage will have some kind of situation set up. All 4 of your answer choices will have situations set up as well, and one of those 4 choices will be your answer that most closely resembles what happened in the passage. And finally, number 10. In number 10, we're asked to find in the answer choices a statement that the author does in fact make, but doesn't support with example, illustration, or evidence. So these answer choices are going to be tricky to get through. You're going to have to find all of them in the passage and then reason how strong is the author's argument at each of these answer choices. Is there examples and illustration and evidence at each of those places? If not, then you'd find your right answer. Because this one is rather unusual where you're having to evaluate 4 different areas of the passage for how strong each of them is, we're going to call this an other question. It doesn't really fall cleanly into any of the previous categories we've already talked about, but it does fall into other. There are many different other type questions out there, so it's difficult to study every single type you might see. Basically, For other questions, just be prepared that you might see some unusual looking questions on the test, and then make sure you align yourself closely with the passage in order to answer those questions. Don't worry too much about other type questions. You're likely to only see 1 or 2 questions that are of the other type on the test. The Kaplan tip at the bottom of your page reiterates this importance of knowing the Kaplan MCAT CARS question types. The reason for this is that the better you know the question types, the more quickly you're going to be able to get to what you already have been practicing, which is handling each of the question types in turn, and being able to, like we always want you to, get that higher score on the test. The review page for this lesson is a great place to come and look at all the different question types and remind yourself what they are and what to do for each of the question types. For instance, main idea questions ask you about the main idea and you use your passage goal to answer them. Detail questions, you find details in the passage and you often can use the question stems to get the context that you need to be able to look up and find that detail in the passage that the question is asking for. Function questions ask the reason why the author is using something in the text, and they often start with because or in order to. Definition and context questions have you go find the meaning of a word or a phrase somewhere in the answer choices, and remember those are the ones with the trap answers of the common definitions that are incorrect within the context. So those are your foundations of comprehension question types. There are also reasoning within the text question types. You can start with inference, and remember here you're deducing what must be true based on the passage. And then we have strength and weaken within the passage questions. There's going to be arguments from the passage, and we're looking to support or contradict these arguments. There's also other subtypes within reasoning within the text question types. But remember, you don't see very many of these on the CARS section. Finally, we get to reasoning beyond the text. We see the apply question type, where we take information from the passage and apply it to a new situation. And then there's also strength and weaken questions here, but these go beyond the passage. There's newly introduced information, and we might see this new information in the question stem or the answer choices. There's also other questions here, and again, not very many of those in the CARS section. Congratulations on getting through this lesson on identifying the CARS question types. Practice identifying these question types and you'll be well on your way to getting that higher score on the test. Happy studying!